Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about how the Associated Press is using NLG and NLP to help its news report. But I want to say a couple things first. I am not a technology expert. I am a journalist. I will try to answer your technical questions, or don't ask me too many technical questions, please. Actually, I will try my best and get you answers. I was the business news editor at AP in 2014 when we decided to automate the creation of corporate earnings stories. And that was my entree into this world. You can see that my title is Director of News Partnerships. It's a big, sprawling job, but the thing that's relevant here is that at the Associated Press, we have a company-wide strategy group on how to use automation and AI in news, and I am the newsroom representative to that. And we often work with startups to build projects. And so those are the partnerships in this case that are being referred to. And also, while I am going to talk about what AP is doing, I want to really add that news organizations all over the world are now really using these technologies much more so than they were 5 years ago when we started, and we are just one of many. Certainly the larger organizations, Bloomberg, Reuters, New York Times, BBC, and Tamedia here in Switzerland are using these, but now even it's starting to be used by many smaller organizations as well. But of course, AP is what I know, so that is what I'm going to talk about today. First, for those of you who may not know, because AP is better known in the United States, we are a not-for-profit cooperative where news organizations are members, as well as we have customers. We solely license our journalism to other media outlets. We are not trying to grow audience traffic on a website or get people to subscribe. And you'll see why these technologies that we're talking about come in very useful for us as a high volume producer of news. When you are producing 2,000 stories per day, anything we do to automate the process has enormous efficiencies across that scale. So again, our primary reason for looking for ways to deploy these technologies is to make our newsroom more efficient, and in some cases to be able to produce additional content that can help us serve new audiences and new customers. Talking about the broader news landscape, again, as I was saying, the news industry in the last 5 years, and even certainly in the last 2 years, has really increased its use of these technologies. And certainly the area of content recommendations and personalization, being able to, using algorithms to distribute news, that's one of the biggest uses of this. As I said, AP is not in that business because we are not serving individuals, we're serving news organizations. But automating workflows, helping journalists find stories. I mean, that's a really growing area, and I'll talk about that a little bit too. And so why is this happening? Unlike 10, 20, 30 years ago, when we were publishing newspapers or you watched news on your TV or heard it on the radio, we now have to produce news for more platforms than ever. We need the Facebook version of the story, we need the Twitter version of the story, Flipbook, we need material for Reddit, we need voice headlines for smart speakers, and hope they're not recording our conversations at the same time. And so there's just more and more versions of essentially the same news story that we have to produce, and this is a tremendous resource burden. It can be a tremendous resource burden for our journalists. So you can see, we moved from when we were very probably single format news organizations all the way to now. AP is talking about streaming and OTT, and so are many other large news organizations. So there's just more and more need to produce different kinds of news products than ever before. And the tools that we use, this certainly has nothing to do with text, but it's an example of the journalists today. I mean, these are real, these are not fake news here. This is actual journalists who are out in the field having to juggle multiple devices, multiple things. It's very much more complicated. So again, generally speaking, we are trying to help our journalists do their jobs more efficiently and also help them kind of decipher the sea of information that's out there and help them cover their topics better. So when the Associated Press thinks about AI in news, we break it down into three areas. There's news gathering, which is how do journalists actually find the news and decide what stories to tell and do their reporting. There's news production, obviously, actually creating the stories, creating the videos, and then news distribution, delivering that to clients or to the customer. And I'm going to talk mostly about the production side because, again, as an agency, that's where we've done the most work and seen the most benefits, and also that's where we started the earliest. I mentioned that we are now automating the creation of corporate earnings stories, and this was our first. I mean, imagine 5 years ago, this field was very small, really. There were not that many companies doing this work. There were certainly not news organizations doing this work. And I'll tell you a little bit about how that came about. As business editor at the time, and again, AP is not Bloomberg and Reuters, so producing financial news is it's not core to our business. And yet, my staff of 60 journalists and editors were spending a tremendous amount of time every quarter writing earnings stories. We were producing about 300 each quarter. Any of you who are familiar with following corporate earnings every quarter, there's about 3 weeks of every quarter where there are just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reports coming out all at the same time, and it's a real challenge to deal with all that effectively as a news organization. This was a problem for us. Earnings were keeping us from doing investigations, corporate watchdog stories, even telling interesting stories about the latest that Apple was doing or Google was doing, and this was a real problem in terms of resource allocation. So we met a startup at the time called Automated Insights, which produced story templates for automating high volumes of content. We identified a data partner for a vendor, an investment research firm, and we created a system. Our journalists wrote the templates. What should those earnings stories look like? And now we are producing nearly 4,000 earnings stories per quarter. These are very short stories. We call them snapshots. They're not sophisticated. They're not, but they are out on the wire, published, many of them in under 5 minutes. This is far faster than my human journalists could have written such stories, and it allows us to feed a business purpose for our newsroom with much fewer resources. This for us was life-changing because suddenly I could assign my reporters to do far more interesting stories now that we weren't on what I called the hamster wheel of earnings reports, just constantly running all the time. And so that began the use of, the recognition at AP that this was powerful technology. And that's when our strategy group was created, and we started looking for more ways to use these technologies. In terms of story templates and automated content creation, our main focus now has been on sports. We are producing game previews and game recaps for many, many sports now. Baseball, both Major League and Minor League Baseball, NBA, hockey, college basketball, and on and on. And in our case, we're now at the point where we're creating stories about sports that our journalists never covered at all. We never had the staff to do that and wouldn't have assigned staff to do it. But particularly with the rise of fantasy leagues and sports betting, there is a market for this kind of content, and automation allowed us to serve that market. We have elections is a very common use by news organizations for story templates, as well as things like weather. I mean, anything obviously with clean, consistent data that's easily structured. We have done some smaller work with polling data in the US around elections. And also we're working right now with a New York state media group to experiment with education data and whether we can't help them produce more local education news for their readers by using automation. So those are some of the things that we're doing around automated content. The number this year, we will produce roughly 40,000 stories using automation. And sounds like kind of a big number, but remember we're producing more than 1,000 stories a day as a global agency with about 1,500 staff. So in the scheme of things, automated content remains a small portion of what we do. Now, I think a really interesting project that we're working on right now is automatically generating summaries from every AP text story. And we're working with a startup out of Columbia University to train this engine to do this. We will copy and paste the text story into their tool. It will generate a summary, and that gets published. And I'll explain a little bit about the importance of summaries. And I apologize for the format here. It's copying and pasting doesn't always work for internal publishing systems, but when an AP journalist sits down to write a text story, they actually write more than the story. They write a short headline, and see it says here, extended headline, and then in the middle, again, sorry about the formatting here, a summary. Now, different news companies want different pieces of the story. So already the journalist is having to take time to create multiple versions of the story. The summary is actually for, while the text story is meant to be read on websites or in print, the summary is meant to be spoken. So TV anchors, radio news reporters, and now smart speakers, the summary is what feeds those formats. So think about when you hear the news versus when you read the news, and now think about the issues around designing a summarization tool that can handle that. So again, some of the issues that we had to deal with, and what we're doing, of course, is taking thousands of examples of human-written stories and summaries and using that to train the algorithm in what is AP style. They have to sound like AP created them, so they have to be created in our style. And so the obvious, certainly, from past tense to present tense, there are no quotes in what broadcasters read, so any quotes in the story cannot get used. There's all sorts of little issues that come along with doing this. One of our biggest challenges was actually back-end or front-end attribution, because often when you write, you would write it the first way, leaving the attribution for the end of the sentence, but many readers of news start at the front end. So that was one of the bigger challenges in creating these summaries and working on the summarization tool that we found. And then, of course, teaching the engine how to recognize what's important in the story. Obviously, takes a lot of work, particularly when they are stories about provocative issues that have multiple opinions. You need to make sure that the summary is as balanced as the text story. So this has been a super interesting project for us, and the goal is to, of course, speed up the amount of time it takes to write the summary, remove that task from the journalist out in the field who's busy doing other things, and we have also, because we have a global newsroom, we have many journalists for whom English is not their first language. And so our idea is that having an engine that will create these summaries will help make them more consistent across the world, which is very important for us. These will be reviewed by an editor before publication. The intent is not to automatically publish, only to automatically generate. But we believe that for us, having these summaries, when we can get them to the quality we want, will save roughly 35 to 50 hours per week of editing time, which for us is big, significant savings, certainly enough to justify this in addition to the improvements on the product. I mentioned this earlier already, so I won't spend a lot of time with it. We often do these projects in collaboration. So we're working with the Columbia Journalism School and Newsday Media Group in New York to look at, focus on their education team and explore a variety of scenarios that might be useful for them in a local market. So can we create templates that help them speed up the process of reporting on school board elections? Or can we help their education reporters find patterns in test score data or graduation rate data that will help them do more interesting and more stories? So this is also an ongoing project that we actually have a grant from a foundation in the US called the Lenfest Institute, which funds journalism projects around local news. So that's something we're working on now and excited about, because if we can solve the issue around local data availability and structurability, then we can hopefully provide even way more news to local US news organizations, which are struggling quite a bit financially. I'm going to talk a little bit about the news gathering and verification process now, which has some aspects of NLP and NLG in it. The biggest is, if you all are familiar with the notion of event detection, in our newsroom, we're calling it news discovery because it sounds slightly less technical. When you're dealing with journalists who don't have this kind of technical knowledge, they can understand news discovery. So the question here is, how can we, we have editors who are watching social media and all sorts of sites and media out looking for news and trying to find them quickly, but of course the number of sources are endless, and the amount of social posts on not just Twitter and Reddit and Facebook, but also Snap and other sources. I mean, it's just endless. And so we are working with a startup called Samdesk, which has algorithms to help us detect those by there's the basic aspect of looking for entities in the post itself around what would be considered big news events, disasters, shootings, weather events, whatever that is, whatever is classified as news, and then kind of overlaying it with some basic checks on who is this poster. We're filtering out bots that are tweeting. We're doing some basic checking around the veracity of the tweet, what's the location and things like that. And so the dashboard in SAM is just kind of a string of tweets that or social media posts that are based on predetermined searches that are set up by editors. We did a 5-week test of this and another event detection company, and of course, there are startups in this area all over the world now. I mean, Japan is doing some really interesting work. There are many others. This is the one that we use. So over a 5-week period, we had 27 journalists around the world testing this and one other system. We collected feedback and we tried to get all 27 of them to fill out a survey. Only 10 did, because it's hard to get people to fill out surveys and things like that, even in our own newsroom when we tell them to. But anyway, 10 journalists who answered the survey identified 50 news events that we found out about earlier because of this system, which alerts in Slack, that we found out about them earlier than we would have otherwise. This for us is also life-changing. The sooner you can find out about something, the sooner you can start making calls, sending a photographer to the scene, doing whatever it is you need to do. And so we are now rolling out SAM to the entire AP newsroom. And just again, to give you an example, SAM is using its algorithms to identify likely news events and then alerting them to journalists in Slack channels. The journalist, obviously, is the one who decides whether this is actually newsworthy, whether it's worth pursuing. And so an example of a workplace shooting in Illinois, this is the first tweet that went into the Slack channel. And this tweeter, what's the word? Tweeter, is that a word? Is basically somebody in that county who just listens to police scanners all the time because that's the thing they like to do. You know, and thank goodness for those people because we find out about things sooner than otherwise. So you can see, like, this is not, I mean, just very basic information, very, you know, quickly typed out. And so this was the first tweet, and then 6 minutes later, the NBC affiliate in Chicago was reporting also. And the way these systems work is, you know, it's looking for clusters of posts as confirmation and designing its algorithm to increase the rating of importance when it starts to see those confirmation tweets and clusters. It also has some severity rankings and things of that nature, which, you know, I won't get into for this purposes, but in any case, like they're constantly working on improving their algorithms to help them more accurately identify true newsworthy posts versus just noise. One question I get a lot, and so I'll answer it, is that they are doing this in multiple this company, they're now also in multiple languages, including Arabic, and many of these companies are using basic translation to help identify news tweeted in other languages. But as you know, I mean, slang and words mean different things in other languages. So, so these companies work very hard on kind of capturing that when they're developing these algorithms. I mean, one of the simple examples that they give is, I don't know about here, but in America we often say, you know, she was on fire. That place was on fire. And it's meant like, that was great. Like, no, there wasn't actually a fire. You know, so you have to teach the robot to recognize when fire actually means fire and not just that someone's like really popular and having a good time. So it's awesome stuff. Great fun. So we're really excited about this because we believe it can make a meaningful difference to our ability to find news. And I think the whole issue of using algorithms to search thousands and thousands of documents instead of investigative reporters spending months reading documents. I mean, these things are really, the amount of investigative reporting that's now being done and sped up as a result of these sorts of algorithms is also amazing. I'll mention quickly in the text, the text part of it is smaller, but just the issue of these technologies in verification. I mean, obviously fake news is a huge problem. Yeah, identifying what's real and what isn't. We actually, as a news agency, will, if you post video on Twitter that's of a newsworthy event, we might try to buy that from you so that we can distribute it. So this is actually a business for us in addition to something that helps our reporting. And so being able to quickly verify and acquire the social media assets is very important. So with a Google News Initiative grant, with their help, we're building a tool called Verify, which does use some NLP to extract words from the tweet, and then as well as computer visioning to go out searching the wide world web for matches. You know, because many times when people post images or videos on Twitter and that are not true, it's not because the image has been manipulated, it's because it's being presented in a different context than it really happened. So I might say a shooting is from Illinois when actually it was 2 years ago in Las Vegas. So we want to be able to detect that very quickly and speed up the time that our journalists spend trying to do those searches themselves with mixed results. So that's primarily, and how this will basically work is that you paste the URL and then it searches and it looks for matches from history, basically, and it will surface, oh, this is a likely match, or that's a likely match. And again, like, it's all about helping, helping our journalists do their work faster. We're also working on a project right now to, when we put out a video, when we send a video to a TV network or a news customer, we will provide a transcript with that video and a shot list. So in the broadcast world, we actually want to tell people at what point in the video does Donald Trump speak, because they might just want to pull that 5 seconds to use in their news program. So they need to know, not just, we don't want them to have to watch the entire video to pull out what they want. We want to help them do that. And so producing these transcripts and these shot lists is a big production operation for AP. We now are doing almost completely automated video transcription using a company called Trent out of London. And they also have automated translation and all of that, which is great. But we're separately from that, it's much harder to actually analyze a video and show and be able to extract text from that, what is happening in the video. But we're working with a startup to train it to do that, train a robot to do that. So in the last couple of minutes, again, just reviewing, our primary strategy behind using these technologies is to free up journalists from doing routine work so they can do more interesting work and investigative work that's impactful and makes a difference. We want to help our journalists find stories faster and more interesting stories. And then we want to be able to produce our content much more efficiently, which frees up room to do these other things and also helps us reach new audiences and clients more effectively. While we're very positive on the impact of these technologies for our newsroom, we certainly understand that there are risks involved. We have to be, and I'm happy to talk more about those, but we're very mindful of issues around bias of data or just simply, accuracy of data. Much concern about the filter bubbles or echo chambers created by algorithm-delivered news. And as we saw from Mark's presentation, the ability to use these tools to create fake news is obviously a big issue too. And I'll finish with, this is one of my favorite examples. This was Quake Bot, which is one of the first things used in this area created by the LA Times. The Quake Bot simply tweets based on US geological survey data. If the data's wrong, then Quake Bot is wrong. And I thought it was, particularly funny that in explaining, tell Quake Bot not to be too hard on himself. We all make mistakes. And that's it. And I know I talked for longer than I should, so we don't have a lot of time for questions, but I'd love to take some.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Is it okay now with the microphone? Yeah. Okay, so we start with a question here.
So thanks for telling us where you are. What is your next step?
So I mentioned the summarization tool that we're using to create summaries from every story. That is sort of the first step of what we see as the promise of versioning. In other words, how do we use these technologies to create multiple versions of stories? Let's say, you're reading on your phone in the morning, so you only want a 50-word version of the story, but maybe on the weekend you want a 1,000-word version, or maybe you like to read just bullet points. You just want quick facts. Producing all of the stories, not just customized by topic, but customized by format, is something that we talk about a lot. And so the summarization tool is kind of the first step toward thinking about how we use NLP in that way. We are doing some work around using image recognition combined with NLG to help automate photo captions. These are not rocket science type projects, but they solve very particular resource problems in our newsroom. So that we are working on a lot of those kind of easy easy gains. But I think more broadly, one of the things we talk a lot is, how do these technologies actually sort of change the role of the journalist? I mean, if we can use algorithms and these technologies to essentially scrape the world for facts, and the journalist as fact finder, kind of takes on a slightly, hey, we have help providing facts. What the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg, John Micklethwaite, often the way he describes it is, journalists don't have to be so much about the what anymore, but can focus more on why and what's next. And so, this is not a technological thing, but it's a cultural thing in how newsrooms function and what is news and how do we produce the news. So I think those kinds of things will start to be more and more talked about as these things improve and as they become easier and easier for smaller newsrooms to use. I mean, right now, again, like for the most part, it's been Bloomberg, Reuters, AP, BBC, Wall Street Journal, really large organizations. And I think you're now starting to see really tiny, smaller organizations figure out how they can use some of these things too. So we'll see.
You were mentioning a lot of collaborations with startups. Basically, it seems like all the tools were developed in collaboration with startups. So I was wondering why AP took this his route versus an internal data science team.
Right. Yes, there are two main reasons, and you're absolutely right. I mean, certainly, Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Wall Street Journal come to mind, but BBC as well as like hiring big staffs of data scientists and engineers to build these themselves. Well, a couple of reasons. I mentioned we are a not-for-profit cooperative. We don't have a big R&D budget. We don't have a lot of money for hiring. We like to devote our hiring to journalists on the ground. And so we kind of hit on this way of working with startups as, a frankly less expensive way of experimenting. And also, but there's another benefit to that we find, which is that working with startups brings skills and energy into the newsroom that the newsroom doesn't always have. As you all know, entrepreneurs have, they're just starting up and nothing is impossible and there's lots of energy. And so we feel that rather than hiring data scientists and engineers, we can identify the best minds. We can go find the machine learning PhD from Columbia, or I had a conversation over the weekend with Krishna Bharat, who created Google News and now is teaching at Stanford. And we talked about having his research students working with our newsroom too. So, I think we feel that overall that approach has benefits beyond issues of cost. Sometimes we actually invest in the startups. I will say that as well. And so there's an investment opportunity component, which thankfully I and News don't have to worry about, but others in my company do. So there you go.
Thank you very much for your talk. Have you performed certain benchmark to compare the results and outcome of certain tasks between journalists and the robots?
Well, certainly, in small ways. Remember, let's take the case of automatically generated stories. Our journalists wrote the templates in the first place. And so, and then we did lots of testing to make sure they were right. What we did there was more about carefully assessing the amount of time. We wanted to really document is this in fact more efficient doing it this way? And then we also did some measuring of corrections, errors. People ask me all the time, do the robots make errors? Well, if they do, it's because of the data, not because the robot itself. And what I always say is robots don't make math errors. Humans very much do, or typos. So that alone actually reduced the error rate. So there are those kinds of things that are identified specifically for each project where we're doing that kind of assessment. I mean, we have a whole matrix of questions that when we are vetting, should we do this project? You know, is it going to save us time? How much time? Is it going to produce new content? Well, does that content actually improve our products? How much does it cost to do it? How much does it cost to maintain? I mean, we've talked a lot in the industry about kind of the shifting, the new jobs. Forget data scientists and engineers, but just editors and journalists today need to be much more data literate than they ever did in the past. And now, I mean, there are editors whose jobs are around data management. I mean, these are not experts. That's just now part of the job if you're doing this kind of stuff. So, so I would say it varies according to the project. How much time are you going to let me talk here, Mark?
5 minutes.
And I'm here both days, so please come talk to me.
Thank you very much. From your story about the event detection, it seems that it really matters to do some minutes to get a story out as quickly as possible. So question one is, how critical are these minutes really? And the second question, how is the process where you balance the quality or validation of such stories versus being out as early as possible?
This speed versus quality is a balancing act that is true without the use of event detection technology. This is something we have always talked about in the news industry. In our world, as a news agency, minutes do matter. Outside the US, we're competing with Reuters and AFP very intensely. And so that does matter. But it matters, again, too, for alerting our journalists so that they can begin the work that's the quality aspect of it. Checking the facts, making the calls, figuring out whether to send resources. One thing that I didn't talk about, but I'll mention just a little bit, we have a head of standards at AP and a code that's quite extensive of news values and principles. So regardless of what technology or tool that we're using, anything we're doing has to be within that framework. And we have a lot of discussions about how we handle breaking news and how we use language to kind of balance those things. Just as an example of that, we very rarely say something was the first, we might say first known or, said to be the first. I mean, so the cautions that you're talking about really get back to the core principles of the news organization, regardless of the tool or the technology used. I mean, one of the things I always say is, decades ago, when the first digital camera started to be used in news photography, there were many of these same kinds of conversations about what that technology meant, what was that going to mean for quality, did we need to disclose to audiences that we were using digital cameras instead of film cameras? I mean, it sounds crazy now, but hey, back then when it was new, so in other words, we're repeating patterns of how new technology, we experiment, we absorb them, we deal with all these issues and best practices around these. And I'll say too, there are many efforts right now to create these best practices and standards for using this technology in news organizations. I mean, I'm involved in, there's a big effort out of the London School of Economics that's funded by Google to explore some of these things, and many others elsewhere, do common language, common standards, helping us understand machine learning and what that means for news. So yeah, absolutely. We talk about that all the time.
Okay, I think it's time for having a break. Lisa, thanks again for your great talk.
Thank you.